So a few episodes ago, we talked about the pay for the Ford CEO, and we had a discussion about how that pay may be skewed a little bit more in favor for an individual versus many of the employees and managers. That also had quite a bit to do with the success of Ford. So as a follow-up, it's important to talk about who makes compensation decisions for these types of corporations like Ford. And usually what happens is that the board of directors and the executives of any company make these types of decisions. So essentially you have the CEO and you have his or her colleagues who are board of directors, as well as fellow executives that are making compensation decisions not only for their employees but also for themselves. So how are these decisions being influenced? Well, there's a lot of debate not debate, but there's a lot of discussion in terms of a variety of different types of inputs these groups use to make compensation decisions. They'll take benchmarks, so they'll compare how pay is allocated for employees and executives in other industries or in similar industries, but also the relationships that these executives and board of directors have with their CEO and fellow executives also play a role. And then that connects to the opinion of value that each of these board of directors have in terms of how much value they think any one individual is contributing to a company, which then in turn influences their ability in terms of thinking about how much pay that person should have. So for benchmarks, with benchmarks, there's executive pay and employee pay. Now the tricky thing about using benchmarks is that you actually have a few interesting pressures with regards to these two things. For executive pay, what you'll see is actually the pressure in the market is for executive pay to continue to rise. So you'll see the force that's happening right now is that as you can make comparisons after comparisons, you'll see that overall the rate of increase of executive or CEO pay is very, very strong. Now with employee pay, you have one pressure where yes, naturally the average amount of compensation for employees have been increasing over time due to inflation or whatnot, but there is something interesting, which is there is a downward pressure that may or may not be noticed. And what I mean by that is that all of these corporations, whether they realize it or not, have an incentive to pay as low as possible to their employee base, meaning they're trying to keep their costs as low as possible. And headcount costs are a substantial amount of costs on any income statement, so there is this pressure. So when you start looking at a benchmark, you realize that the pressure going up is counterbalanced with the pressure going down. So the benchmark itself is being influenced by a self-perpetuating opinion that the pay needs to stay as low as possible for employees. Now let's talk about relationships. Now it's pretty reasonable to assume that the more you interact with someone, the more you're going to think that they're going to have value for your business and the more you will want to allocate more pay to them. So if I'm a board of directors of a company and I interact with the CEO of that company on a much more frequent basis than any of the employees, that CEO has more opportunities to get my attention, to make a case to why he or she adds value to the business. So my opinion of the value they individually contribute is going to be influenced by that, and then frankly then my opinion in terms of how much they should be compensated will be influenced. So what are the consequences of a model like this? Well, first of all, the economic gains that any company will generate, a greater share of those gains are going to be allocated to the executives because the board of directors have more interaction with them. They see benchmarks that are already going at a much higher rate for executive pay versus employee pay. And their opinion of value based on those two things are going to be influenced and skewed much more heavily. So therefore, a greater share of the economic gains a corporation that generates will be given to executives versus employees. So when decisions are made in terms of what's fair or not, the inputs that are being used to determine what's fair are already biased. So how can we improve this capitalistic model so that people's hard work is actually being more fairly represented in those dialogues when compensation is being determined? Well, for one, representation. So essentially, I did not spell this right, so let me get this correct here. What type of representation do employees have on board of directors? So should there be a board of director that is voted by the employee base that is not part of the senior executive team, that represents the employees, and also is the final person that makes, not the final person, but has a key vote in terms of approving a compensation plan. That person will have tenure so that that board of directors cannot fire them or have them ousted just because they're not making decisions that are in line with what the CEO wants. So that's one approach. Two is voting. Should the employees have some type of voting to approve the compensation plans for the executives as well as management as well as employees? And then the third, tax breaks based on pay multiples. So what I mean by that is essentially a CEO's pay may be 10 times more than the average employee pay. But if it's 20 times more, so that the gap or the disparity between how much he and the board of directors, he or she is allocating to his or her own pay is so far skewed from the employees, the higher that multiple is, should there be an increase in terms of taxes to that corporation. Because there are externalities that are created when you skew and take so much of the economic gains for just a few people versus the employees that have worked for that. When you create an externality like that, you have to pay for the externality you've generated. And one way to do that is through tax breaks or tax increases based on what the multiple or ratio is from a CEO to an employee. So we talked about board representation, employee votes, and CEO pay or approval, and then the CEO multiple and how that translates to potential tax calculations. There's plenty of other ideas. Thank you.